Welcome to episode 5 of The Examined Faith. I'm your host, Tuppy Morrissey, and with me today is Dr. Fitzroy Morrissey. As you may have guessed from our common surname and our similar good looks, Fitz is my elder brother, so I'm going to have to call you Fitz rather than Fitzroy. That feels a bit unnatural. So Fitz is Associate Professor of Islamic Studies and Law at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of Pembroke College. He recently published the excellent The Renewal of Islam. And today we're going to be tackling the rather large topic of Christianity and Islam, thinking a bit about how the two religions differ and where there might be some similarities. So Fitz, thank you very much for coming on today.
Thanks very much, Tuppy. It's a pleasure to be on and nice to talk to you.
Good. That's relief. So, Fitz, to start, let's just talk a bit about your own perspective. So, you are a Christian yourself, but you spent years working on Islamic studies. How did you first get into Islam in a serious way?
Let's drive. How long have I been studying Islam for? I suppose I studied Arabic as an undergraduate, also here in Oxford, at Pembroke College. And I suppose I became interested in Islam in my last years at school, probably for a number of reasons. First, I had the good fortune to be able to study a bit of Arabic while I was still at school, and a great teacher, Harun Shawani. And I was interested at school in the study of religion and theology. That was one of my A-levels. I was also doing history, and in history we did the Crusades, and I became very interested in sort of the medieval Islamic world and looking at the Crusades through the lens of Arabic writing on the Crusades, Arabic chronicles. Remember reading a great book by a Lebanese scholar called Amin Ma'louf, The Crusades Through Arab Eyes, and that sort of got me thinking it would be interesting to study Islamic history and Arabic more seriously. I was interested in religion and comparative religion, and our dad helped, I think, inculcate that interest, and he had a very sort of wide range of books in his library, particularly on kind of the mystical dimensions of various religions. So I read quite a bit about Sufism, the mystical form of Islam, which ended up being the area one of the areas that I really have concentrated on in my studies and in my academic work. So then, when I came to Oxford, the Arabic course at Oxford was and still is a very kind of wide-ranging course, which is one of the things that attracted me to it. So you study Islamic history, Arabic literature, both medieval and modern, but also Islamic religion. And I suppose I was really interested, I was most interested in the religion course, and you can take various optional papers in your final years. And one of the papers I took was on Sufism, particularly on a Sufi thinker called Ibn Arabi, and that really, again, I had a great teacher, Ron Nettler, so that helped kind of deepen my interest, and I sort of got captivated by studying this particular intellectual tradition within Islam. So that was my way in, and I was fortunate then to be able to stay on at Oxford for postgraduate studies, and then to ultimately be able to teach as well here. That was really my journey into the subject. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. And I'd like to come on to Sufism a bit later when we look at some potential parallels. And I'm thinking, a lot of the listeners to this podcast will be Christians, probably the vast majority. Why do you think it's valuable for them to explore Islam and other faiths rather than just focusing on their own tradition? Do you think you've gained spiritually, I'm sure intellectually from it? What would you say about that?
Yeah, I mean, I personally think so. And when I mention to other Christians at church or in other sort of more specifically Christian contexts what I do, people react in different ways and often feel a bit surprised. And particularly that my work is academic. It's not I'm not studying Islam from a kind of explicitly Christian or sort of missiological perspective or anything like that. Although I would say that my Christian faith certainly shapes my academic work. And for me, many of my sort of scholarly heroes, the people whose work I find very helpful and inspiring in terms of their scholarship on Islam, were Christians and often wrote sort of quite explicitly from a Christian perspective. People like Marshall Hodgson, who was a Quaker historian at the University of Chicago, Wilfred Cantwell Smith, who was a Presbyterian minister and founded the Institute of Islamic Studies at McGill in Canada, and particularly Kenneth Cragg, who is a Anglican priest and bishop. He was bishop in Jerusalem. He ended up here in Oxford towards the end of his life. And Cragg, he has many books on Islam, but probably his most famous is called The Call of the Minaret. And it's an extremely learned and sensitive treatment of Islamic theology and practice, and he takes the declarations of the Islamic call to prayer, the adhan, as kind of the framework for his presentation, and he's also kind of writing from an explicitly Christian perspective, and he addresses this question, and he says at one point, he has this quite sort of striking line. He says that not to care about Islam would be not to care about Christ, I think is the statement that he makes. He says, because the valid Christianity is the interpretative Christianity, and we have a duty as Christians to explore our faith, as it were, in dialogue with others, and to explore both kind of points of contrariety and similarity, or similarity and difference. And that for me, I think, is quite inspiring. And I think clearly there's a sense in which if you're studying another faith tradition, it helps sort of sharpen your own sense of what it is that you believe and what are the points of difference, where are the dividing lines. But also, I think there are things in other faith traditions that can sort of enrich your own intellectual perspective on religion, at least, and probably your own spiritual perspective as well. So yes, I find that, and sort of more and more in more recent years, I've sort of been a bit more upfront about my own Christian faith and how I'm engaging with Islam as a humanistic scholar, but also as a Christian. And I think that it gives one a perspective that I think other atheist scholars of Islam or non-religious scholars of Islam probably don't, and it gives one a perspective as a Christian that Christians who are not engaging with other religions probably they don't have that either. So I'm fortunate that I'm able to spend most of my time thinking about religious questions, and so inevitably that, I would say, shapes my own thinking on my own faith as well as on Islam.
Yeah, I noticed that in the acknowledgements to the renewal of Islam that you mentioned how you were working this all out from the perspective of your own Christian faith, which is something I hadn't picked up, I think, in your first book. So that was an interesting shift. And you talked about, noticing similarities, differences between the faiths. Let's come to certain areas maybe of continuity. What for you would be the biggest areas of similarity between Christianity on the one hand and Islam on the other?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the more recent scholarly work on Islam, and particularly on the Quran, and the rise of Islam, has focused on situating Islam in its sort of late antique religious context, a context that was pervaded by Christianity and Judaism as well. And clearly, I think anyone who picks up a copy of the Quran will see that Islam, right from the beginning, is in very close dialogue with the Christian tradition and the Jewish tradition, and that Christianity, Christian theological concepts, biblical figures and stories, terminology, imagery. These really provide the framework and the ingredients for the Quran's own theology. This is not so much a sort of question of influence, tracing influences, but of looking at how the Quran kind of engages creatively, polemically with the Christian background, is responding to it and kind of subverting it in some ways and confirming it in others. So right from the beginning, Islam is in close dialogue with Christianity, and that means that there are theological truths in the Quran that I think Christians can happily affirm. One thinks of how the Quran describes Jesus as the Word of God. How the Quran is very interested in the miracles of Jesus, and healing the blind and the leper and reviving the dead. These are all affirmed by the Quran. The Quran seems to affirm the virgin birth. So that when it comes to kind of, I suppose, some of the fundamental doctrines of Christian theology, there are points of commonality, continuity, even with the Quran. And of course, there's much more fundamentally kind of commitment to kind of biblical monotheism. And the Quran sees itself as sort of confirming what is true in Judaism and Christianity, or in the biblical tradition. So there's that sort of on the Quranic side. I think when you look at Sufism, which I know you want to get onto that later.
Yeah, can you just explain? No, you can explain now. I think to our listeners what actually is Sufism.
Sufism is one of, and probably the most important mystical tradition within Islam. So mysticism being that kind of piety which seeks some kind of communion or union with God. And it originates in the 9th century, the Christian era, in Iraq, and it becomes very widespread. It's wrong to think of Sufism as somehow kind of hived off from Islam, a kind of esoteric tradition within Islam practiced by a few unique individuals. It's by the 11th century, 12th century, and onwards, it's absolutely everywhere in the Muslim world. It's becomes absolutely central to Islamic thought and practice. This is sort of catalyzed by the emergence and then spread of Sufi orders, which are a bit like monastic orders, but again they're much more. I suppose they're more worldly in some respects.
The Sufi ones are more worldly.
The Sufi ones, yeah. And so it sort of really is absolutely central to Islamic thought, as I've said, and it's really only in more recent times, so from the second half of the 19th century onwards, that Sufism has been under kind of more sustained attack from kind of within the Islamic tradition. So to come back to the question about kind of continuity and points of similarity, and within Sufism, there's a very strong emphasis on like a mutual love between God and man, an emphasis on a kind of on the sort of inner spirituality of the individual believer, and in the sort of later Sufi traditions, you also get some quite interesting thinking about Jesus in particular, who becomes a kind of exemplary figure in the poetry of Rumi and later Persian poets, in the writing of Ibn Arabi and his followers. Jesus is one example, at least, of the perfect man, who is a kind of perfect locus of manifestation of God's names and attributes, and sort of has this kind of cosmic function.
And you've written quite extensively on that, haven't you?
Yeah, that was. So I've written a couple of books on this Sufi intellectual tradition associated with Ibn Arabi, and one book on this idea of the perfect human, and another on how a particular Sufi thinker called Ajili interprets other religions and the pre-Quranic scriptures and the pre-Muhammadan prophets from his Sufi perspective. And so in those works, they're very much kind of still governed by Islamic theological concepts. But in those works, I think there is a quite a large kind of common ground on which Muslims and Christians can meet to kind of think in dialogical ways. Another aspect of that tradition, which is interesting, when seen through Christian eyes, is the way in which the figure of the Prophet Muhammad gets interpreted as a kind, he gets interpreted as a kind of logos type figure. There's a lot of discussion of what they call the Muhammadan Light, which they say is the first created thing that existed before the creation of the world, and through which God gave existence to the world, and is the source of knowledge and inspiration for other prophets and saints.
So like some areas of similarity to the proslogion of John's Gospel, but
yes,
some differences definitely there.
Some differences as well, but I think I think all of those discussions come from a similar kind of perspective, and they're informed probably by Christian ideas, at least sort of indirectly. So yeah, I think that is one area where as a Christian reader of these texts, you might see grounds for dialogue, and there's clear sort of parallel there. Yeah, I mean, I could go on, but I think in those instances, there's what might be called kind of salvific truth there within Islam.
Okay. And you reminded me, you were talking about the sort of polemical nature of the Quran sometimes in relation to the Christian or Jewish scriptures. It reminded me of, the Genesis stories are clearly in dialogue with things like the Epic of Gilgamesh or the Enuma Elish, right at the beginning of Genesis. So that's, a common narrative in different religions. And that brings me to maybe some areas of difference. How do you think Christians should understand the Quran's relationship to the Bible in terms of those differences, perhaps? What would, a massive question, but like from a historical, theological perspective, if a Christian were to pick up a Quran, which perhaps many Christians haven't done, I must admit I have not done that, what would be a good approach to their reading?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So yeah, I think I briefly mentioned this polemical edge to the Quran's engagement with Christianity, and I was thinking particularly of a recent book by Gabriel Said Reynolds, who's professor at Notre Dame and one of the leading Quranic studies scholars working at the moment, and he shows, I think, quite convincingly how the Quran is really utilizing Christian narratives and Christian language or biblical language and biblical narratives and biblical kind of theological concepts, and kind of turning them around and using them for its own purposes. And clearly, the Quranic Jesus is not the biblical Jesus. It's not identical to the biblical Jesus. He's not the Jesus of Christian theology. The Quranic Jesus is made to deny that he claimed to be the Son of God. The Quran has various references which seem to deny other fundamental Christian doctrines like the Trinity. It says, "Do not say three." The crucifixion is a famous. There's one verse of the Quran which speaks about the crucifixion, and it's a very ambiguous verse. It says that the Jews claim to have killed Jesus, but they didn't. Rather, and the way that it's usually translated, it only seemed to them that they did.
Okay.
Muslim interpreters of the Quran have taken this in various ways, but the most common explanation is that it wasn't Jesus who was crucified. So it's a kind of docetic reading of that.
Could you just explain what you mean by docetic reading?
Yeah, so
anyone who doesn't understand
that the figure who was crucified only seemed to be Jesus, from the Greek verb dokeo, and usually it's said in the Quranic exegesis, at least, that another individual, whether Judas Iscariot or someone else, was substituted for Jesus, and that God sort of put the likeness of Jesus upon him. So kind of there are various kinds of docetic Christianity which which in a sense deny the that Jesus took on a real human body. So that clearly there's a denial there of fundamental tenet of Christian belief, and I think that speaks to what I would see as the main, the most fundamental point of divergence between Christianity and Islam is, on the one hand, at least if we're talking about Western Christianity, the strong emphasis on kind of the fallenness of human nature, the need for redemption in Christ, which takes place through the crucifixion and resurrection, and on the other hand, Islam's Islam doesn't really have a notion of the fall or original sin, and therefore, there's a much more optimistic view of humanity, as it were, and the view is basically that belief in God, submission to God, is innate in the human being. That's kind of the natural tendency of mankind, and it's only because of education and culture that people get kind of put off that path. But if they're educated in the right way, then there's nothing stopping people from believing in God and submitting to Him, and particularly submitting to His law, living life in accordance with the divine will, and therefore there's no need for redemption. There's no need for atonement. So Marshall Hodgson, who I mentioned earlier, the historian from the University of Chicago, he has a nice essay on Christianity and Islam as frameworks for life. And while Christianity he says, is about responding to redemptive love, Islam is about responding to what he calls a total moral challenge. So there's an emphasis on orthopraxy in Islam, on living life correctly. That's sort of what the Sharia is all about. And there's an optimism that humans are able to do that without a savior in the person of Jesus. So I think that is where there's this kind of where the gap is widest, as it were, between.
And I hadn't really thought about that gap very much. Do you personally find, well, I guess the answer is yes, but the Christian, the more perhaps pessimistic outlook of Western Christianity more realistic, more compelling than the Muslim optimism, as you phrased it?
Yeah, I do think just as a sort of empirical observation, that if one's experience of life, or mine, and I think many people's, is that this world and humanity are both sort of basically good and both basically evil. There's this sense that there is things should be good, and that we get glimpses of that goodness all the time, but yet often they don't live up to that kind of ideal, and that's how I would understand kind of the fall and sin in many ways.
Missing the mark, from
Islam, I think, is
the Greek.
Yeah. I think Islam is not naive that there's evil in the world, but the way to control that evil is through the law primarily, and there's a lot of recent scholarship on Islam. It was a famous book in Islamic studies published about 10 years ago now by a scholar at Harvard who sadly died soon after, called Shahab Ahmed, and the book's called What is Islam? And it's a great book. It's not an easy book, but it's a really insightful book in many ways. And he argues strongly against what he sort of calls the legal supremacist or the nomocentric interpretation of Islam, that it's all about law, it's all about Sharia. And this has been kind of this is a criticism of Western scholarship on Islam, that it focuses too much on the law. So he, for instance, shows how while Islamic law prohibits the drinking of wine, wine poetry has been absolutely fundamental to how Muslims have expressed their Islam and interpreted what it means to be Muslim and interpreted revelation. So he wants to sort of get us away from focusing too much on the law. And I think there's some truth to that. And we have to have a more sort of expansive conception of what Sharia is. So the Sharia is not just a system of rules and regulations. It's partly that. But there are various... The Sharia puts all actions into 5 categories, or Islamic jurists do. There are mandatory actions like praying. There are forbidden actions like drinking wine or eating pork. Mm-hmm. And if you don't do the mandatory actions, then you'll be punished by God. If you do the forbidden actions, then you'll be punished by God. But then there are these intermediary categories as well of actions which are desirable or recommended, and on the other hand, actions which are sort of reprehensible. And these sort of don't... There are sort of otherworldly consequences to them, but they're usually not thought to be this worldly consequences to them. Judges don't go around punishing people for performing
lust or something
reprehensible. So, like singing, for instance, is sometimes put in the reprehensible category.
Wow. Okay.
Certain kinds of music. So in that sense, the Sharia is kind of a system of morality as well as a system of law in the more narrow sense. And
it seems, sorry to interrupt, I was thinking there's maybe a parallel as well to Judaism and how more recent Christian scholars have tried to move away from this narrow view of Judaism just being about, or, the Old Testament just being about the Torah. And I think E.P. Saunders has wrote quite a bit about that. And yeah, I think it is interesting because there can be a caricature of Judaism as well. So, it's just follow the Torah and then you're right with God, and then Jesus comes along and it's all different, which I think is probably simplistic. Reductionist.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. It's a criticism of particularly kind of older generations of Western scholarship on Islam, that they do have this sort of a certain kind of Protestant conception of what religion is. It's about individual. Real religion is about individual belief, faith, individual piety, and sort of legalistic kinds of religion are sort of ersatz kinds of religion, or they're not. They're not the good kind of religion, and Islam kind of falls into that legalistic category along with Judaism. I think a lot of the more recent scholarship that I'm drawing on is in what we're talking about. People like Bernard Weiss, who is he was based in Utah and actually was a Christian minister himself. He he has this much more rounded, gives a much more rounded picture of what the law means in the Islamic context, and there's a kind of spiritual component to the law as well, and the way that the law is interpreted. And coming back to the earlier discussion about Sufism, there's this sort of caricature that you have Sufism on the one hand and the law on the other, and the Sufis don't really sort of care about the law. They're more interested in kind of the interior dimension of religion, and the jurists are only focused on kind of the external dimension of religion. In fact, all the great Sufis were very insistent on the importance of upholding the law. Many of the great Sufis were jurists and vice versa. So in a sense, they go hand in hand in the Islamic context, and mysticism and an emphasis on the law. So sort of coming back to the earlier point, I think Islam does try to regulate perhaps the kind of human inclinations towards evil through the Sharia. And there's as I've said, more of an optimism that can be done, and that I suppose in Islam, salvation is through faith and works. There's some ambiguity on that, because there are certain hadith which indicate all you have to do is believe in God and in His Prophet, but I think typically the view would be that one needs to implement that faith through adherence to the law. I think that would be a point of difference, at least from within kind of Protestant tradition. I mentioned Kenneth Cragg earlier, so I think he's highlighted this point in a number of works.
But I guess again there's ambiguity within Christianity as well, because as you said, it's maybe more of a Protestant tradition, salvation by faith alone, whereas there are definitely ways you can read the Bible as saying the faith has to lead to works in order to be saved, which is a massive question. One other question I just wanted to ask about the Quran in terms of how it's responding to the Bible. You said, particularly, let's say, in terms of the figure of Jesus. How do Muslims understand, therefore, that the Quran was, revealed to Muhammad by the angel Jibril? How do they reconcile the fact that it seems to be, in some ways, a direct response, unless the angel is kind of engaging in biblical criticism?
Yeah, I mean the main sort of conceptual tool that Islamic exegetes employ to explain this kind of relationship with the biblical tradition is the concept, in Arabic it's called tahrif, and it comes from the Quran. The Quran uses a word of that root and other words meaning, and it means something like corruption or tampering or alteration. And so the claim made is that the Injil, the gospel, was similarly revealed to Jesus in the same way that the Quran was revealed to Muhammad, and that Christians have distorted its meaning, either through actually sort of tampering with the text by adding things and taking things away, or by misinterpreting it. So those are kind of the two common ways in which that notion is understood. So then I think this is sort of what your question is getting at. The claim then would be that that the truths of Islam are there in the Bible as it originally was, but the Bible as used by Christians is not the true Bible.
Okay, I have heard that before. Yeah,
and I mean the point about kind of biblical criticism is interesting, because then when you look, when you get into the 19th century, and this begins really in India, when you look at kind of the interreligious polemics that are going on in India, Muslim scholars start making use of kind of the higher criticism, historical critical scholarship on the Bible to kind of back up this claim of distortion. Another claim that's often made in the kind of polemical context is that Christianity is kind of the invention of Paul, who distorted kind of the simple monotheistic teaching of Jesus. But
and is that a position that's common today within Islam?
Yeah, it's hard to know. I think it's it's certainly found in the medieval polemical literature, and probably one could find it in modern polemical literature as well. There's an interesting book published by someone called Samuel Ross. I can't remember the title, but it's on sort of the biblical turn in Islamic or Quranic exegesis, and it's about how in the pre-modern periods, very few Muslim scholars engaged actually with the biblical scriptures, with the canonical Bible, and that's partly because they didn't have access to it. It's partly because there are certain hadith or traditions which seem to kind of warn Muslims against consulting the Jewish and Christian scriptures. But then in the modern period, you get a sort of explosion of Muslim engagement with the Bible, and you get new perspectives. There's a very prominent scholar in India called Syed Ahmed Khan who argues very strongly that the Christian Gospels, the Gospels are authentic. They are the gospel that God revealed, and they've only been misinterpreted. And he actually writes a commentary on the Bible, or at least he writes on the beginning of Genesis and on Matthew's Gospel from a Muslim perspective. And so with that, I suppose you get a more kind of serious engagement with the Bible, and there have been scholars like Shabir Akhtar here in the UK who has written Muslim commentary on Galatians. So yeah, I think there's probably more of a greater knowledge, a greater depth of engagement with the biblical tradition in the modern period. So in some ways, in the modern period, there's more. The polemic has taken on a sharper edge, but in other ways, there's also kind of this tradition of scriptural reasoning and doing theology together through reading one another's scriptures.
Okay, yeah. So you see maybe a bit of hope for some interfaith dialogue through that, perhaps.
I mean, I think any kind of interfaith discussion needs to be honest. It needs to be rooted in kind of an accurate knowledge and a fair and objective account of each other's scriptures and each other's theological traditions. And speaking very, painting with a very broad brush, in the pre-modern period, often there wasn't that kind of knowledge base. There's kind of an echo or a kind of faint awareness of certain key theological ideas or scriptural passages of the other tradition, but they're, because they didn't have the resources, there wasn't that same depth of knowledge or breadth of knowledge. And so, what we have today is, any Muslim or Christian can read one of the scriptures and can engage with the key texts of the key theological texts of each respective tradition. And so, the resources are certainly there for a more objective and honest appraisal of both the similarities and differences. And of course, you now have also a big literature, the kind of theological literature, Christian theological literature and Muslim theological literature, which engages with the other religion. So yeah, the potential is there for a real dialogue, in the sense of a dialogue which is honest and objective, and doesn't smooth over differences, but also is fair in acknowledging similarities.
Great. Well, I think that could be a good place to wrap up today. Yeah, like I said, I've got your book here, The Renewal of Islam. I can get that on the camera. Lovely cover, and I would highly recommend reading that. I very much enjoyed it, and I think our conversation today has made me realize that I still don't actually know that much about Islam and even other religions. And I've taught religious studies in schools, and there's often it's quite surface level. So I think I found it really helpful to explore some of the similarities and differences, and hopefully some of our listeners have enjoyed it. And you've recommended or mentioned a lot of books, a lot of scholars that people can take a look at, as well as your own work. So there's plenty to dig into there.
Yeah, I'd just say if listeners want a kind of more a brief survey of the Islamic intellectual tradition, then my other book, A Short History of Islamic Thought, is probably a good place to start.
It's
probably a good place before you go to The Renewal of Islam, which focuses on Islamic reformist thought in the modern period and how it's engaging with that whole tradition.
Yeah, I would agree with that, having read them both. And yeah, if you did enjoy listening to our discussion today, please download the Faithwave app. This podcast is part of Faithwave. Please give the video a like, subscribe to our channel, share it with anyone who might be interested, as we look to grow the channel, the app, so that we can get even more interesting, not even more interesting guests, more interesting, sorry, Fitz, more interesting guests. You get what I mean on this podcast. So please share away, and please subscribe. Fitz, thank you very much for taking time to chat with me. Hopefully see you soon, and God bless to all our listeners.
Yeah, thanks. It was great fun. Thanks.
Good.
Bye.